I spent the end of March, all of April, and the first week of May in Paris. It was during this stay that I met the Desbrières family, into which my marriage was soon to introduce me. As my health was restored, I understood that I could not remain in Paris. Marshal Augereau directed me to Marshal Lannes, who received me very kindly on his staff. The Emperor, in order to be able to keep watch over any movements the enemy might be tempted to make during the winter, had established himself in the midst of his troops' cantonments, first at Osterode, then at the chateau of Finkenstein, from where, while preparing a new campaign, he governed France and directed his ministers, who sent him their reports each week. The portfolios containing the various documents provided by each minister were assembled every Wednesday evening at the home of Monsieur Denier, the elder, Under-Secretary of State for War, who dispatched them every Thursday morning by an auditor of the Council of State charged with delivering them to the Emperor. But this service was performed very poorly because most of the auditors, never having left France, not knowing a word of German, and unfamiliar with the currencies and postal regulations of foreign countries, no longer knew how to conduct themselves once they had crossed the Rhine. Moreover, these gentlemen, unaccustomed to fatigue, soon found themselves overwhelmed by the exertions of a journey of more than 300 leagues, which required a continual march of 10 days and 10 nights. One of them even carried negligence so far as to let his dispatches be stolen. Napoleon, furious at this incident, sent an express to Paris to order Monsieur Denier to entrust the portfolios in future only to officers who knew Germany and who, being used to hardships and privations, would carry out this mission with greater exactness. Monsieur Denier was greatly embarrassed to find such a man, when I presented myself with Marshal Lannes' letter requesting me for his staff. Delighted to ensure the prompt departure of the portfolios, he warned me to hold myself ready for the following Thursday, and handed me 5,000 francs for posting expenses and for the purchase of a calèche, which came very much in season for me, as I had little money with which to rejoin the army deep in Poland. We left Paris around the 10th of May. My servant and I were well armed, and whenever one of us was forced to leave the carriage for a moment, the other kept watch over it. We knew enough German to urge on the postilions, who, seeing me in uniform, obeyed an officer infinitely better than they did the auditors, and so, instead of taking, like those gentlemen, 9.5 or even 10 days to travel from Paris to Finkenstein, I arrived there in 8.5. The Emperor, delighted to have his dispatches 24 hours earlier, first praised my zeal, which had led me to ask to return to the army despite my recent wounds, and added that since I drove the post so well, I was to set off again that very night for Paris, from where I would bring back other portfolios, which would not prevent me from being present at the renewal of hostilities, which could not take place before the beginning of June. Although I had by no means spent the full 5,000 francs that Monsieur Denier had given me, the Marshal of the Palace had as much given to me for the return to Paris, where I hastened at once. I stayed only 24 hours in that city and set off again for Poland. The Minister of War gave me another 5,000 francs for this third journey. It was much more than was necessary, but the Emperor wished it so. True, these journeys were very tiring, and, above all, exceedingly tedious, although the weather was very fine, for I rolled nearly a month, day and night, tête-à-tête with my servant. I found the Emperor again at the chateau of Finkenstein. I feared I might have to go on postillioning just when the fighting was about to begin, but fortunately, officers had been found to carry the dispatches, and the service was already organized. The Emperor authorized me to go to Marshal Lannes, who was at Marienburg when I rejoined him on the 25th of May. He had with him Colonel Sicard, aide-de-camp to Augereau, who had kindly brought back my horses. I saw again with great pleasure my dear Mère Lisette, who could still be of good service. The fortress of Danzig, besieged by the French during the winter, had fallen into their hands. The return of fine weather soon reopened the campaign. The Russians attacked our cantonments on the 5th of June, and were sharply repulsed on all points. There was, on the 10th, at Heilsberg, a fight so bloody that several historians have called it a battle. The enemy were again beaten there. I shall not go into any detail about this affair, because Marshal Lannes's corps took very little part in it, arriving only at nightfall. We did, however, receive a rather large number of cannonballs, one of which mortally wounded Colonel Sicard, who, already struck by a bullet at Eylau, had barely healed before returning to take part in new combats. The good Colonel Sicard, before expiring, charged me to bid farewell to Marshal Augereau and handed me a note for his wife. This painful scene distressed me greatly. As the army set out in pursuit of the Russians, we passed through Eylau. Those fields, which 3 months earlier we had left covered with snow and corpses, now offered charming carpets of green, speckled with flowers. What a contrast! How many brave warriors lay resting beneath those green meadows! I went to sit in the very place where I had fallen, where I had been stripped, where I too would have died, if a truly providential sequence of circumstances had not saved me. Marshal Lannes wished to see the little hill on which the 14th of the line had defended itself so valiantly. I led him there. The enemy had occupied that ground since the time of the battle. Nevertheless, we still found intact the monument that all the corps of the French army had raised to their unfortunate comrades of the 14th, 36 of whose officers had been buried in the same grave. This respect for the glory of the dead does honor to the Russians. I paused for a few moments at the spot where I had received the cannonball and the bayonet thrust, and thought of the brave men who lay in the dust, and whose fate I had been so near to sharing. The Russians, beaten on the 10th of June at Heilsberg, made a precipitate retreat and gained a day's march on the French, who found themselves, on the evening of the 13th, assembled in front of Eylau, on the left bank of the Alle. The enemy occupied Bartenstein, on the right bank of that same river, which both armies were following in parallel. Benningsen, having his magazines of provisions and munitions at Königsberg, where the Prussian corps was located, wished to move on that city before the French arrived, but, to do that, he had to recross to the left bank of the Alle, on which Napoleon's troops, coming from Eylau, were posted. The Russian general hoped to anticipate them at Friedland in time to cross the river before they could oppose him. The reasons that led Benningsen to keep Königsberg made the emperor desire to seize it, and he had constantly maneuvered for several days to outflank the enemy's left, in order to draw them away from that place, toward which he had detached Murat, Soult, and Davout to oppose the Russians if they reached it before us. But the emperor did not stop at that precaution, and, foreseeing that, to gain Königsberg, the Russians would try to cross the Alle at Friedland, he wished to occupy that town before them, and during the night of the 13th to the 14th of June, he directed the corps of Marshals Lannes and Mortier there, as well as 3 divisions of cavalry. The rest of the army was to follow. Marshal Lannes, who formed the vanguard with Oudinot's grenadiers and a brigade of cavalry, reached Postenen, 1 league short of Friedland, at 2 in the morning, and had that town reconnoitred by the 9th Hussars, who were driven back with losses, and the rising sun allowed us to see a large part of the Russian army massed on the other side of the Alle, on the high ground between Alleno and Friedland. The enemy were beginning to cross on the town's old bridge, near which they were building 2 new ones. The objective of each of the 2 armies was easy to understand. The Russians wished to cross the Alle to reach Königsberg. The French wished to prevent them, and to drive them back to the other side of the river, whose banks are very steep. There was only the bridge at Friedland. The Russians had all the more difficulty in debouching from the town into the plain on the left bank, as Friedland's exit at that point is hemmed in by a vast pond, as well as by the stream called the Mill, which runs in a very deep ravine. To protect their passage, the enemy had established 2 strong batteries on the right bank, from which they dominated the town, and a part of the plain between Postenen and Heinrichsdorf. With the plans and respective positions of the 2 armies thus known, I will now explain succinctly the principal events of this decisive battle, which brought peace. The emperor was still at Eylau. The various corps of the army were moving toward Friedland, at a distance of several leagues, when Marshal Lannes, after marching all night, arrived before that town. Had the marshal listened only to his impatience, he would have attacked the enemy on the spot. But already they had 30,000 men formed in the plain in front of Friedland, and their lines, with the right facing Heinrichsdorf, the center at the mill stream, and the left at the village of Sortlack, were being reinforced unceasingly, while Marshal Lannes had only 10,000 men. He placed them, however, very skillfully in the village of Postenen and in the wood of Sortlack, from where he threatened the Russians' left flank, while, with 2 divisions of cavalry, he tried to stop their march on Heinrichsdorf, a village on the road from Friedland to Königsberg. The fighting began briskly, but Marshal Mortier's corps soon appeared, and, in order to dispute the Russians' road to Königsberg, while awaiting further reinforcements, he occupied Heinrichsdorf and the ground between that village and Postenen. Nevertheless, it was not possible that Mortier and Lannes, with 25,000 men, could resist the 70,000 Russians who would shortly be facing them. The moment was, therefore, becoming very critical. Marshal Lannes sent officers at every instant to warn the Emperor to hasten the arrival of the corps he knew were marching behind him. Mounted on the swiftly set and sent first toward the Emperor, whom I did not catch until his departure from Eylau, I found him beaming with joy. He had me placed beside him, and, as we galloped, I had to explain what had happened before I left the field of battle. When I had finished my account, the Emperor said to me with a smile, "Have you a good memory?" "Fair, sire." "Well then, what anniversary is it today?" "The 14th of June." "That of Marengo." "Yes, yes," the Emperor resumed, "that of Marengo, and I am going to beat the Russians as I beat the Austrians." Napoleon had such conviction on this point that, as he rode along the columns, whose soldiers greeted him with many cheers, he kept saying to them, "Today is a happy day, the anniversary of Marengo." It was past 11 o'clock when the Emperor arrived on the battlefield, where several army corps had already joined Lannes and Mortier. The others, as well as the Guard, were arriving in succession. Napoleon adjusted the lines. Ney formed the right, placed in the Sortlack wood. Lannes and Mortier held the center between Postenen and Heinrichsdorf. The left extended beyond the latter village. The heat was stifling. The Emperor granted the troops an hour of rest and decided that, at the signal given by 25 guns firing at once, a general attack would be made, which was carried out. Marshal Ney's corps had the roughest task, for, hidden in the Sortlack wood, it had to come out and enter Friedland, where the main forces and reserves of the enemy were massed, seize the bridges, and thus cut off all retreat for the Russians. It is hard to understand how Bennigsen could have resolved to place his army in front of the Friedland defile, where it had the Allee at its back, with steep banks, and found itself facing the French, who held the plain. The Russian general, to explain his conduct, later replied that, having a day's lead on Napoleon, and unable to imagine that the French could cover in 12 hours a distance equal to what his troops had taken 24 hours to march, he had thought that Lannes' corps, which he found at Friedland, was an isolated vanguard of the French army, and that it would be easy to crush. When his illusion faded, it was too late to shift his army back to the other side of the Allee, because the Friedland defile would have caused him certain loss, and he preferred to fight with energy. Around 1 in the afternoon, the 25 guns emplaced at Postenen having all fired together by order of the Emperor, the battle was engaged along the whole line. But our left and our center advanced at first very slowly, in order to give the right, commanded by Ney, time to take the town. That marshal, coming out of the Sortlack wood, seized the village of the same name, from which he moved very rapidly on Friedland, overturning everything in his path. But on the stretch from the wooden village of Sortlack to the first houses of Friedland, Ney's troops, marching in the open, found themselves exposed to the terrible fire of the Russian batteries, which, placed behind the town on the heights of the opposite bank, inflicted immense losses on them. This fire was all the more dangerous because the enemy gunners, separated from us by the river, could aim with security, seeing that our infantry were unable to attack them. This serious disadvantage could have spoiled the capture of Friedland, but Napoleon remedied it by sending 50 guns, which, placed by General Saint-Armand on the left bank of the Halle, fired across that river against the Russian batteries, and made a hail of round shot rain down on them, which soon dismounted the guns. As soon as the enemy's artillery fire was silenced, Ney, continuing his bold advance, drove the Russians back into Friedland, and entered pell-mell with them into the streets of that unfortunate town, where the shells had just kindled a vast conflagration. There was a terrible hand-to-hand fight with bayonets, where the Russians, piled on top of one another and hardly able to move, suffered enormous losses. At last, despite their courage, they were forced to retreat in disorder, to seek refuge on the opposite bank by recrossing the bridges. But here a new danger awaited them. General Saint-Armand's artillery, having moved closer to the town, took the bridges in flank, soon shattered them, and killed a very great number of Russians who were hastening to cross in flight. Everything that still remained in Friedland was captured, killed, or drowned in attempting to cross the river. Up to that point, Napoleon had, so to speak, kept his center and his left marking time. He now pushed them rapidly forward. The Russian general Gorshakov, who commanded the enemy center and right, listening only to his courage, wanted to retake the town, which would have been of no use to him, since the bridges were broken, though he did not know it. He therefore rushed at the head of his troops into burning Friedland, but, repulsed frontally by Marshal Ney's troops who held the town, and forced to regain the open, the enemy general soon found himself surrounded by our center, which drove him up against the Halle opposite Kloschenen. The Russians, enraged, defended themselves heroically, and, though broken on all sides, refused to surrender. A great many died under our bayonets, and the rest let themselves be rolled down the banks into the river, where almost all were drowned. The extreme right of the enemy, composed in large part of cavalry, had tried during the battle to seize or turn the village of Heinrichsdorf, but, sharply repulsed by our troops, it had fallen back on the banks of the Halle under General Lambert. Seeing Friedland occupied by the French, the Russian left and center destroyed, he gathered what regiments he could from the right wing, and withdrew from the battlefield, moving downstream along the Halle. Night prevented the French from pursuing them, and so this was the only enemy corps that escaped the disaster. Our victory was as complete as could be. All the Russian artillery fell into our hands. We had taken few prisoners during the action, but the number of enemy killed or wounded was immense, and rose to more than 26,000. Our loss came to only 3,000 dead and 4,000 to 5,000 wounded. Of all the battles fought by the Emperor, this was the only one where the number of his troops was greater than that of the enemy. The French had 80,000 combatants, the Russians only 75,000. The remnants of the enemy army marched in disorder all night, and withdrew behind the Priegel, whose bridges they cut. Marshals Soult, Davout, and Murat had not been able to be present at the Battle of Friedland, but their presence had induced the Prussians to abandon Königsberg, of which our troops took possession. Vast supplies of every kind were found in that city. I met with no unfortunate mishap during the Battle of Friedland, though I had been exposed to the greatest dangers. Here is how. You saw me set out in the morning from Postenen, by order of Marshal Lannes, to go at full gallop to warn the Emperor that, the enemy crossing the Halle at Friedland, a battle seemed imminent. Napoleon was at Eylau. I therefore had nearly 6 leagues to ride to catch him, which would have been a small matter for my excellent mare if I had found the roads clear. But, as they were crowded with troops from the various corps hurrying to the aid of Marshal Lannes, before Friedland, it was absolutely impossible for me to gallop along the road. So I struck across country, with the result that Lisette, having had to leap fences, hedges, and streams, was already very tired when I reached the Emperor, just as he was leaving Eylau. Nevertheless, without taking a minute's rest, I had to turn back with him to Friedland, and, although this time the troops drew aside to let us pass, my poor mare, having covered 12 leagues at a gallop in one stretch, 6 of them across country and in very great heat, was truly exhausted, when, on the battlefield, I rejoined Marshal Lannes. I realized that Lisette could not serve well during the action. I therefore took advantage of the rest. The emperor granted the troops to look for my servant and change mounts. But in the midst of so large an army, how was I to find my baggage? That proved impossible. I therefore returned to headquarters, still riding breathless Lisette. Marshal Lannes and my comrades, witnessing my predicament, urged me to dismount and let my mare rest for a few hours, when I noticed one of our hussars leading by the bridle a horse he had taken from the enemy. I bought it, entrusted Lisette to one of the marshal's escort troopers so that he could pass behind the lines, feed her, and hand her to my servant as soon as he spotted him. I mounted my new horse, resumed my place among the aides-de-camp, and set off on my errands in turn. At first, I was very satisfied with my mount, until the moment when, Marshal Ney having entered Friedland, Marshal Lannes sent me to him to warn him of a maneuver the enemy was making. Hardly had I entered the town when my devil of a horse, who had done so well in the open country, found himself on a little square where all the houses were ablaze, the paving stones covered with furniture and burning beams, amid which a great number of corpses were sizzling. The sight of the flames and the smell of charred flesh frightened him so much that he would neither advance nor retreat, and, bringing his 4 feet together, he stood stock still and snorted loudly, without the numerous spurs I gave him having the least effect. Meanwhile, the Russians, momentarily regaining the advantage on a nearby street, drove our troops back to the point where I was, and from the top of a church and the surrounding houses, poured a hail of bullets around me, while 2 cannons, man-hauled by the enemy, fired grape-shot at the battalions among which I found myself. Many men were killed around me, which reminded me of the position I had been in at Eylau, in the midst of the 14th, since I was by no means curious to receive fresh wounds, and since, besides, by staying there I was not accomplishing my mission, I simply dismounted, and, abandoning my obstinate horse, slipped along the houses to join Marshal Ney in another square, which officers pointed out to me. I spent a quarter of an hour with him. Bullets were falling there, but not nearly as many as in the place where I had left my mount. At last the Russians, repelled with the bayonet, having been forced to fall back in all directions toward the bridges, Marshal Ney urged me to go and bring this good news to Marshal Lannes. I took, to leave the town, the way by which I had come, and again passed across the small square where I had left my horse. It had been the scene of a most bloody combat. One saw there only the dead and the dying, among whom I noticed my stubborn horse, loins shattered by a cannonball and body riddled with bullets. I therefore made my way on foot to the edge of the suburb, quickening my pace, for on every side the burning houses were collapsing, and I feared being buried beneath their ruins. I finally managed to leave the town and reach the edge of the pond. The heat of the day, joined to that given off by the fire which was devouring the streets I had just crossed, had drenched me with sweat. I was suffocating, and was falling with fatigue and need, for I had spent the night on horseback in riding from Eylau to Friedland. I had then returned at a gallop to Friedland, and I had not eaten since the day before. I therefore looked with displeasure at the necessity of crossing on foot, under a blazing sun, and through very tall wheat, the immense plain that separated me from Postenen, where I had left Marshal Lannes, but a happy chance again came to my aid. General Grouchy's dragoon division, having had not far from there a sharp engagement with the enemy, had, though victorious, lost a certain number of men, and the colonels, according to custom, had gathered the horses of the troopers who had been killed, led in hand by a detachment which had moved to one side. I saw this party, each dragoon leading 4 or 5 horses, heading toward the pond to water them. I addressed the officer, who, embarrassed by so many led horses, was only too glad to let me take one, which I promised to send back that evening to his regiment. He even designated an excellent animal that had been ridden by a non-commissioned officer killed during the charge. I therefore mounted this horse and quickly returned toward Postenen. I had barely left the shores of the pond when it became the theatre of a most bloody combat, which arose from the desperate attack General Gorshakov made in order to reopen his line of retreat by retaking the road to Friedland, held by Marshal Ney. Caught between that marshal's troops and those of our center, which were pushing forward, Gorshakov's Russians defended themselves valiantly in the houses near the pond, so that if I had remained in that spot, where I had intended to rest for a few moments, I would have found myself in the middle of a terrible melee. I rejoined Marshal Lannes just as he was moving on the pond to attack in the rear Gorshakov's corps, which Ney was driving frontally out of the town, and I was therefore able to give him good information on the configuration of the ground on which we were fighting. If the French army had taken few prisoners on the field of Friedland, it was not so the next day and the days following, for the Russians, driven with the sword at their backs, thrown into complete rout, exhausted with fatigue, left their ranks, lay down in the fields, and we took a very great number of them. Much artillery was also picked up. Whatever could escape from Bennigsen's army hastened to recross the Niemen, behind which the Emperor of Russia was posted, who, probably recalling the dangers to which he had been exposed at Austerlitz, had not thought it advisable to attend in person the Battle of Friedland, and hastened, on the second day after our victory, to ask for an armistice, which Napoleon granted. It was 3 days after the memorable Battle of Friedland that the French army at last caught sight of the town of Tilsit and of the Niemen, which, at that point, is only a few leagues from the frontiers of the Russian Empire. After a battle, everything is sorrow in the rear of a victorious army, whose march is marked by corpses, by the dying, and by the wounded, while the warriors who have survived, soon forgetting those of their comrades who fell in the fighting, rejoice in their successes and march gaily toward new adventures. The joy of our soldiers was immense on seeing the Niemen, whose opposite bank was occupied by the remnants of that Russian army they had just beaten in so many encounters. Thus our troops sang, while a gloomy silence reigned in the enemy camp. Emperor Napoleon established himself at Tilsit. His troops camped around the town. The Niemen separated the two armies, the French holding the left bank, the Russians the right. Emperor Alexander having asked for an interview with Napoleon, it took place on the 25th of June, in a pavilion built on a raft anchored in the middle of the river, in view of the two armies lining the banks. It was a most imposing spectacle. The two emperors arrived, each from his side, accompanied only by 5 of the principal personages of his army. Marshal Lannes, who, by virtue of his rank, had flattered himself he would accompany the emperor, saw Marshal Bessières, the intimate friend of Prince Murat, preferred to him, and did not forgive those marshals for what he considered a slight. Marshal Lannes therefore remained with us on the quay of Tilsit, from where we saw the two emperors embrace as they met, which excited many cheers in both camps. The next day, the 26th, in a second interview, which again took place at the pavilion on the Niemen, the Emperor of Russia presented to Napoleon his unfortunate friend, the King of Prussia. This prince, whom the events of the war had caused to lose a vast kingdom, of which only the small town of Memel and a few wretched villages remained to him, preserved a bearing worthy of the descendant of Frederick the Great. Napoleon received him politely, but coldly, because he believed he had cause for complaint against him, and planned to confiscate a large part of his states. To facilitate the conversations between the two emperors, the town of Tilsit was declared neutral, and Napoleon ceded half of it to the Emperor of Russia, who came to establish himself there with his guard. These two sovereigns spent about 20 days together, during which they settled the fate of Europe. The King of Prussia, during these conferences, was relegated to the right bank, and did not even have a lodging in Tilsit, where he came only very rarely. Napoleon one day went to pay a visit to the unfortunate Queen of Prussia, whose grief, they said, was very great. He invited that princess to dine the next day, which she accepted, doubtless against her heart. But, at the moment of concluding peace, it was necessary to try to soften the anger of the victor. Napoleon and the Queen of Prussia cordially detested one another. She had insulted him in several proclamations, and he had paid her back in his bulletins. Their meeting, however, showed no trace of their mutual hatred. Napoleon was respectful and attentive, the Queen gracious, and seeking to win over her former enemy, whom she needed all the more because she knew perfectly well that the peace treaty was creating, under the name of the Kingdom of Westphalia, a new state for which electoral Hesse and Prussia were to provide the territory. The queen resigned herself well enough to the loss of several provinces, but she could not consent to that of the strong place of Magdeburg, whose possession secures Prussia's safety. For his part, Napoleon, whose plan was to appoint his brother Jerome King of Westphalia, wanted to add Magdeburg to that new state. It seems that, to keep this important city, the Queen of Prussia was employing, during the dinner, every effort of her charm when Napoleon, to change the subject, having praised the superb rose the Queen wore at her side, she is said to have replied, "Would your Majesty like this rose in exchange for the fortress of Magdeburg?" Perhaps it would have been chivalrous to accept, but the Emperor was a man far too practical to be won over by pretty words, and it is said that he confined himself to praising the beauty of the rose, as well as of the hand that offered it, but did not take the flower, which brought tears to the Queen's beautiful eyes. The victor, however, did not seem to notice. He kept Magdeburg, and politely escorted the Queen to the boat that was to carry her to the other bank. During our stay at Tilsit, Napoleon reviewed his guard and his army in the presence of Alexander, who was struck by the martial air and the bearing of those troops. The Emperor of Russia, in turn, showed a few fine battalions of his guards, but he did not dare display his line troops, so reduced was their number at Heilsberg and Friedland. As for the King of Prussia, to whom there remained only feeble remnants of regiments, he did not show them. Napoleon concluded with Russia and Prussia a peace treaty, whose principal articles were the creation of the Kingdom of Westphalia for the benefit of Jerome Bonaparte. The Elector of Saxony, having become the ally and friend of France, was raised to the dignity of king, and received, moreover, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, composed of a vast province of Old Poland, taken back from the Prussians. I pass over the less important articles of the treaty, whose result was to restore peace among the great powers of continental Europe. In elevating his brother Jerome to the throne of Westphalia, Napoleon added to the mistakes he had already made when he had given the kingdom of Naples to Joseph and that of Holland to Louis. The peoples felt humiliated at being forced to obey foreigners who, having done nothing great on their own, were, on the contrary, rather insignificant, and had no other merit than being brothers of Napoleon. The hatred and contempt these new kings drew upon themselves contributed immensely to the emperor's downfall. The King of Westphalia was, above all, the one whose actions made the most enemies for Napoleon. Peace having been concluded, the two emperors separated with mutual assurances of attachment, which, at that time, seemed sincere. That concludes the 27th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.